I want you to look closely. I'm going to show you something that's rare, something that I hope is not on the verge of extinction. Behold, the small-town newspaper publisher. We live in a time where community newspapers are closing. The big corporate-owned newspapers are merging. Newsrooms have been cut back drastically. And the reporters that are left are assigned news stories based on clicks and likes of Facebook. Governments have their own television stations. They stream their information directly to the public, bypassing the news media altogether. As a newspaper publisher, I'm faced with fighting the proclamation that print is dead and resisting the recommendations to go all digital so I can get more likes on Facebook and monetize my Facebook and my website so that I can become an Instagram influencer, whatever the heck that means. I'm given two options. I can give in to the immense pressure, or I can fight back, return to my roots, get better at what I do. And what is it I do as a newspaper publisher and journalist? I provide accurate, reliable facts in a meaningful context, so readers have the information they need to make sound decisions about their lives, their communities, and their governments. And what are my roots? I'm a Southerner. I'm more peculiar than that I'm a Southern newspaper publisher, which comes with it a whole deeper level of responsibility when it comes to the truth. I'm called obstinate, hard-headed. I'm told I pick way too many fights. I'm told that I just don't like people. I like people. Well, in theory, I liked people. Not so much up close. To understand me and my pursuit of truth, you need to understand my background, where I came from. I grew up in Mississippi Delta, the home of cotton, the blues, and great storytellers. I was raised in Mississippi, Greenville, Mississippi, in the 1960s and 70s. Greenville is known for the Hot Tamale Festival, for Doe's Eat Place, for being the childhood home of writers like Shelby Foote and Walker Percy. When I was a child, it was most famously known for its daily newspaper, the Delta Democrat-Times, and its publisher and founder, Hotting Carter II. Big Hotting started his paper in the 1930s. He fought for religious and racial tolerance in a state that was torn apart by strife. When I was a child, he turned the paper over to his eldest son, Hotting Carter III, who lived with his family just a couple of houses down from us on Kirk Circle. The ages of the Carter grandchildren matched the Outzen tribe, and our families were close. Now, I need to explain something about the Mississippi Delta. Now, when the child and the parent have the same first name, the parent's name is often prefaced with big and the child little. Big Matt, little Matt. Big Martha, little Martha. Big Hotting, little Hotting. Now, I somehow escaped that. I'm Richard McLean Outzen Jr. Unfortunately, I was never called Little Richard. Now, that probably had to do because my dad grew up in the Depression, and he loved Charlie Chan movies. So rather than using our names when we were growing up, we were given numbers. I was number 1 son. Hugh was number 2. Rob, number 3. Martin, number 4. Now, we had 2 siblings that were born after us about 5 years later, both in the same year, 1969. They avoided the numbers. They were just called the little ones. And even though Drew and Susan are in their 50s, we still call them the little ones. Big and Little Hotting were part of a small handful of Mississippi publishers and editors that took on segregation and Jim Crow laws. Where people agreed or disagreed with their editorials, they talked about them every day. Their words mattered. They resonated not only in Greenville, but across the state of Mississippi, often getting national attention. Now, in the mid-50s, in the 60s, we saw the rise of the white citizens' councils in Mississippi and in the South. Think of them as the Chamber of Commerce for racists, or what Big Hotting liked to call the uptown version of the Klan. The citizen councils opposed integration of public schools, black voter registration, anything they considered meddling in the Southern way of life. Their weapons were economic boycotts, firing people, And when that failed, violence against publishers, civil rights activists. Every Mississippi town had a council, and if you were a white male, you were expected to be a part of it. In 1958, my dad worked for a farm implement company in Indianola, Mississippi, servicing the farmers in the fields. One day he was called to the office. He met his uncle and the owner of the business. They told him he had a promising career in sales. But to be successful in Indianola, he had to join the council. My dad felt trapped. He had a wife and newborn son. He signed the paper and had the dues deducted from his paycheck. Years later, he told me how ashamed he was. But he felt trapped. He didn't have a choice. That night he went home to talk to Mom and talk about what had happened. They made the decision to leave to leave Indianola and go to Yazoo City. He started a promising career in insurance. He became very successful without the help of a council. Big Hotting understood the intimidation tactics of the white citizen councils. He exposed them for the thugs that they were. When he wrote an article for Look magazine, he talked about the spread of this menace across the South. He was targeted by state lawmakers. They debated in the Mississippi House of Representatives his article. They called it a willful lie. They actually voted to censure him, even though he wasn't a member of their body. And Big Hotting, being Big Hotting, responded in Big Hotting fashion. He took the front page of his newspaper and put an editorial. By a vote of 89 to 19, the Mississippi House of Representatives has resolved the editor of this newspaper into a liar. If the charge were true, I'd be well qualified to serve in that body. It is not true. So to even things up, I resolved by a vote of 1-0 that there are 89 liars in the state legislature. But then he took it even further, and this is why I loved him so much. I am hopeful that this fever, like Ku Kluxism, that arose from the same kind of infection will run its course before too long a time. Meanwhile, those 89 character mobbers can go to hell, collectively or singularly, and wait for me to change my mind. They needn't plan on returning. It was editorials like this one that garnered Big Hotting a Pulitzer Prize, national attention. He earned the moniker spokesman of the New South. He became an inspiration to a whole generation of young journalists. So much that when I travel the country and I talk to someone about being from Greenville, Mississippi, Big Hotting's name always comes up. In 1969, he gave a speech at Mercer University. He talked about journalism being a dedicated profession, similar to teaching or the ministry, whose objectives were not making a profit or even making friends. He saw the goals of journalism being to keep people informed, to make people think, and to make people ashamed. 30 years later, when I started my newspaper, I had Big Hotting as my role model. Times had changed. Most of the southern newspapers were owned by big corporations. Their coverage was more pro-business and less combative. We pushed against that. We're an alt weekly. We're a free tabloid that depends on advertising to survive. We pick winners and losers every week. We investigate the powerful. We write forceful editorials. In the early days, readers, advertisers, and politicians didn't know what to do with us. I had investors then, but I also had an agreement that I was solely responsible for the coverage of our newspaper. Politicians would go to my partners and try to get us to change what we were writing about them. Maybe do something a little bit favorable. Maybe back off on a story. Being the mature adult that I was, I punished them. I doubled down. I dug deeper. I wanted to send a message that if you had a problem with our paper or you wanted to talk about different kind of coverage, there was only one person to see. I didn't do it out of ego. I did it because if people figured out they could work around me, then our paper would be worthless. Now, in the South, the most powerful person in a county is a sheriff. Only a dummy takes on the sheriff. In 2005, I was a dummy. When Hurricane Katrina was barreling down on the Mississippi Gulf Coast in New Orleans, a 65-year-old black man was naked in a shower in the Escambia County Jail being repeatedly tased. When he collapsed, they strapped him to a chair, wheeled him back to his cell, tied a towel over his face. A few hours later, he was dead. The death of Robert Bogan drew very little publicity. Not until we had a civil rights activist come and talk to us about it. He told us how the long-haul trucker had a mental episode in a dollar store. It knocked over a display. He was arrested for criminal mischief and aggravated assault. He spent 11 days in the Escambia County Jail without his prescribed medication, without being allowed to see his family. Robert Bogan spiraled into madness. He refused to eat. He took off all his clothes. He would sit in the middle of his cell, rocking back and forth, clenching and unclenching his fist. He urinated and defecated all over himself. The offense that led to his death was he spit on a nurse. For that, he was pepper sprayed, stripped, thrown into the shower, and tortured to his death. We wrote about the death of Robert Bogan. I wrote editorials calling for better medical care in the facility. The sheriff responded with a statement that Robert Bogan had died of a defective heart condition. And it was unknown what his restraints and struggles had, the impact that they had on his health. The family sued. Civil rights activists agreed with us. They did a peaceful march on the jail. I covered the march. I walked with the protesters. A week after the march, I was called to an emergency meeting of my newspaper's board, which is never good. Sitting at the table was the sheriff. He charged me with biased reporting, and that the only reason he hadn't filed a defamation suit against the newspaper was his respect for my partners. Then he slid a photo across the table. It was secretly taken by his investigators of me at the march. My partner said, "What did I have to say?" I picked it up, looked at it, said, "This is a really good photo of me. Could I please have a copy?" They were not amused. They demanded that I fire the reporter that wrote the story. I refused. They demanded that I write a retraction and an apology to the sheriff. I refused again. They told me they would take the newspaper away from me, and I said I'll form a new one tomorrow. They threatened lawsuits. They threatened to ruin me. I stood firm. We went around and around. Finally, one of my partners looked at me and said, "Rick, what would it take for you to write something favorable about the sheriff?" I stood up and I said, "When he quits killing people in the jail." And I walked out. Now, the next few weeks for the paper weren't easy, but something happened. Instead of losing advertisers, we picked up advertisers. We had more readers for the paper than ever before. Our finances stabilized. People agreed that we had taken a stand and supported us. Meanwhile, the sheriff had 2 more deaths in the jail. He had to fire his jail director, make significant changes in the health care there, and my partners backed off. 2 years later, when the sheriff ran for re-election, the candidate we endorsed defeated him. I had taken on the most powerful person in Escambia County and somehow won. I felt like I'd finally lived up to the example of Hod and Carter. The death of Robert Bogan in our coverage was my resolute man moment. I stood resolute for justice against insurmountable odds without even knowing if I would survive another day as a publisher, and somehow prevailed. Today, we live in an era where we have more information at our fingertips than ever before. You're no longer seen as readers, viewers, or listeners of news. You're consumers of news. And the technology is such as you're fed a steady diet of information that agrees with your opinions, your likes, your interest. If you're pro-Second Amendment, you'll get a steady feed of the importance of gun ownership. Pro-environment, you'll learn about the ills of climate change. And mixed in with your news feed are ads. Websites that you visited, stores that you shopped, things that you may be even just thinking about buying, because the internet knows more about you than you want to admit. And sadly, not everyone providing you that information cares about the facts. The name of the game is clicks. Their goal is to manipulate you into supporting or buying something. For newspaper publishers, we have to try to get you to care about who's providing you your information. And we have to get better at what we do. When VCRs came out, we were told that movie theaters would disappear. But what happened? Movie theaters got better. IMAX screens, surround sound, stadium seating, beer and wine being served. And attendance has increased to new levels. As a publisher, I need to focus on keeping a good relationship, building trust with my readers. Yes, it's essential that I get the facts straight, but I also need to be transparent. And my methods, my sources, show you how I connected the dots so you can take that information and assess it for yourself. For me, my journalism is storytelling with a purpose. My foremost allegiance is to you, the reader. Not to give you just what you want to read, but what you need to know. As I walk the streets of Pensacola, it's not unusual for me to run up to somebody and they tell me how much they enjoy the paper, that they're faithful readers. And then they'll add a caveat. But I don't always agree with you, Rick. And I say agreement was never my goal. If I made you think, if I made you care, then I'm happy. And while I may be a rare breed as a Southern newspaper publisher, as long as I get comments like that, I'm hopeful that my breed won't become extinct and that words and truth will matter. Thank you very much.